Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for the first installment of the Thran Chronicles, the story of the origin of Phyrexia and the Lord of Phyrexia, Yawgmoth. So, in this story, we're going to be jumping around chronologically. We're actually going to start out with Yawgmoth having assembled a fair bit of power. So the story starts on the first day of the Thran Phyrexian War, and the location is the Meghedan Defile. It was hot that day. The Thran army was large and featured an array of troops. 2,000 elite mountain dwarves led by Commander Curtisworthy. Their plate armor was covered in brown canvas to hide them from being noticed. They wielded battle axes as tall as the dwarves themselves. And even in that armor, the dwarves were totally unaffected by the heat. The 40,000 humans that made up the infantry were not so lucky. They moved in a decidedly dejected fashion. The Thran commanders had a real challenge keeping the barbarians in line. 20,000 cavalrymen wore wet cloths over their faces to keep the dust that was churned up by their horses out of their mouths. The heat was especially hard on the elves. There were 10,000 of them. They had abandoned their regular clothing in favor of white robes, but they were sun-beaten and haggard. These were healers and mages not meant for this grueling environment. They slowly trudged at the rear of the army. 10,000 Viashino marched at the army's flank, completely unfazed by the heat. The lizard men were clearly unhappy to be here. They only marched at the order of their leaders, the Bay. On the opposite flank were the hulking Minotaurs. Their strength was undeniable. They were the most dangerous troops of the Thran army. Their eyes begged for battle, and they marched proudly. Mixed into different parts of the army were artifact warriors, mantis soldiers with giant blade arms, and metallic serpents with razor mandibles. Great wooden flying ships flew above the assemblage. The Thran army boasted 300 of them in total. This titanic force had been forged out of the troops from every nation on Dominaria. They were all joined in a singular purpose: to stop one man, a man who had proven to be an absolute monster. That man was Yawgmoth the Betrayer. In spirit, Yawgmoth was more demon than man. He had slaughtered his own people in a daring midnight raid. He had done this to stop them from turning against him. Yawgmoth was now holed up in Halcyon. The entire city belonged to him. When the Thran army grew close enough to see Halcyon, the dwarves bellowed out a defiant yell. Halcyon itself was an incredible sight. It sat atop a cliff 1,500 feet up. Once, this was the heart of the Thran Empire. Now that heart beat for Yawgmoth alone. The Thran army started preparations to siege Halcyon and strike down Yawgmoth. Unbeknownst to them, Yawgmoth wasn't actually inside Halcyon. He was inside a bunker with his Phyrexian army. The underground chamber he was in was dug to slant down into the surrounding desert, and the opening was concealed with muslin that matched the sand's coloration. This made the people inside invisible to the passing Thran army. Yawgmoth had 4 more bunkers like this arrayed around the oncoming Thran army. Each bunker held 5,000 troops. When Yawgmoth gave the signal, these troops would burst out of concealment and fall upon the hapless Thran. Yawgmoth smiled at the sound of the dwarven war cry. Soon he would be rewarded for all of his planning. No one would survive this. He was so excited by the possibility, he almost ordered the attack, but he relented, choosing to wait for the perfect moment. Even now, the Thran's flying warships were changing formation. They would encircle Halcyon, flying out of cannon range. They would then demand Yawgmoth's surrender, but he would not yield to these visionless weaklings. He drew out a flat box that contained a miniature version of the battlefield. Tiny power stones glittered in particular locations. Yawgmoth touched one of these crystals and was rewarded with a whistling sound. The Thran army heard the noise and cast about looking for the source. It appeared that the shriek was emanating from the sun itself. Soldiers stared upwards, squinting against the sun's brilliance. The whistling sound was replaced by a shrieking noise. Yawgmoth had hidden his airships high in the sky, right beside the sun. The Thran army was caught unawares. The Phyrexian airships' cannons tore apart the Thran's flying vessels. Most of the ground troops milled about in terrified confusion. The dwarves and minotaurs whipped their axes upwards towards this airborne foe. Most missed their mark, but the weapons that flew true ended up smacking against the Phyrexian warships and then fell back in a deadly rain on their original wielders. Thran ships fell in scores, landing on the poor hapless Thran below. Each boom of a ship exploding represented hundreds of lost troops. Yawgmoth smiled to himself. His plan was working perfectly. The cannons he had equipped his vessels with were worth their weight in gold. The smile slid from his face, though, as some of his warships unexpectedly started to explode. It turned out that the Thran alliance had managed to salvage some of the cannons Yawgmoth had lost when he attacked his own people 6 months ago. These pilfered cannons were slung under some of the Thran airships, and the Thran were using them to deadly effect. Yawgmoth pressed another power stone on his map, and suddenly the desert started to eat the Thran army. Holes opened all over the desert floor. Minotaurs, elves, humans, and dwarves alike tumbled in and never came back out. Each hole was filled with scything blades that chewed their occupants apart. Yawgmoth spoke a single word: "Arise!" The sands boiled, and corpses were heaved aside as hundreds of metallic crabs emerged from the holes. The Thran had nowhere to escape. Minotaurs bellowed war cries, but even their stout blows had no real effect on the crabs' metal carapaces. The elves unleashed nature magic. Desert scrubs swelled and grew, ensnaring both the crabs and Thran troops. Rust magic was employed, which caused some of the crabs to fall apart, but also had the unintended effect of the dwarves' axes crumbling to dust. Nature's creatures were pulled through the aether to aid the Thran. Bears, giant spiders, and wolves bounded across the desert only to be slaughtered by the crabs. Scavenger folk darted amongst the crabs. Their enchanted hex iron stripped the crabs apart, but in the process, many of the scavenger folk lost their lives. For every crab taken down, they lost 40 some odd of their number. Yawgmoth reveled in the spectacle. And then he touched the 5 power stones that would mobilize all the troops hidden across all 5 bunkers. Yawgmoth's Halcite Guard marched forth from their hiding spots. They held power stone swords and axes, and their dedication to Yawgmoth had been reinforced with a war spell that ensured these humans would not stop or surrender. In response to the appearance of the Halcite Guard, giant twisters appeared to the north and south. Dust devils moved inside the twisters, and they surged towards the Phyrexian troops, catching them up and tossing them far away. Yawgmoth was somewhat impressed that the elves possessed a modicum of useful sorcery. He touched a dark power stone, and a giant hulking figure strode out of the bunker. It was a Phyrexian behemoth, vaguely simian and forged out of pure black metal. It had teeth as long and sharp as swords, and its hands were big enough to hold or crush a dozen men at one time. Fear tore through the Thran army. They knew what this monstrosity could do. The behemoth charged out, and hundreds died. Hot on its heels was a second Phyrexian behemoth. The 2 titanic beasts started to tear apart the Thran army, even reaching into the sky to grab Thran airships and dash them into the ground. They made quick work of the elves. The mantis constructs of the Thran, though, proved to be more troublesome. Even though they were getting decimated by the behemoths, the constructs managed to embed themselves into the black metal of the behemoth. So as that happened, more constructs swarmed up the behemoth's body until it was completely covered in a mass of moving metal. The behemoth pitched forward and smashed into the ground thunderously. Yawgmoth cursed. This must be Glacian's doing. The Halcyite guards surged towards the fallen behemoth, but Yawgmoth ordered them back. Unfortunately, it was too late. The war magic moved them forwards. They were doomed. The behemoth's fallen body tore open, and its inner wiring whipped out in every direction and destroyed everything in reach. Thran soldiers and Halcyite guards were obliterated in a heartbeat. Yawgmoth was enraged. I should have used Phyrexians. Human flesh is too fallible. Ultimately, this setback would change nothing, though. Yawgmoth moved on to the next step of his plan, capturing the Null Sphere. The Null Sphere was a broadcast station that let the Thran monitor and somewhat control every artifact creature in their empire. But Yawgmoth had learned the Null Sphere's secrets. The Thran only knew how to use it to shut down rogue troops and view what their constructs were doing. In Yawgmoth's hands, it could actually turn the Thran's weaponry against them. Yawgmoth used his magic to lift his chair up into the air, taking him up towards his personal airship. He would wipe out this army, and when that was done, he would conquer all of Dominaria and claim it for himself. All right, my friends, that wraps up the first installment of the Thran Chronicles, the epic story of the birth of Phyrexia and the story of Yawgmoth's rise to power. I hope you enjoyed this installment. If you like what we're doing here, you can support the channel by joining the channel membership or the Patreon. Until the next installment comes out, go enjoy some more stories on this channel, and I will see you next time. Until then, remember, my friends, lore is life.